unions play, because they're very partisan. They're using schools to try to promote agendas and indoctrination. They don't put the kids' interests at front. In fact, we saw that during COVID. Chicago Teachers Union they didn't want to have kids in school at all. Los Angeles. And then you'd see them, they'd be out, some of the union people would be out, going to the Bahamas, living their best life while these poor kids suffered. So people saw that, and they realized, in Florida, we beat them on school choice, we beat them on COVID, and we just did paycheck protection. No automatic deduction of union dues for teacher unions. So teachers can write a check or pay, but they can't just have the dues deducted or even just have an authorization form. That is now causing a lot of teachers to bail on this because, quite frankly, they realize it's not in their interest. I've done big pay increases for teachers in Florida based on me working with the legislature. It had nothing to do with these school unions. So I think liberating people from school systems that are controlled by those groups, I think is really, really important for the future of this country.
Thank you so much for being here, Governor DeSantis. I guess my question is just as someone from a younger generation, how do you see passing on the baton of freedom, especially when it comes to the LGBTQ issues, and how does your position differ from Ankeny and Trump, and how do you see your role as president?
Well, I can't really speak to them. I mean, I think that the approach I take is simple. I treat people as individuals, not as members of groups. I think we need to get away from this idea of trying to put people in different groups. I don't think it's healthy for society. I also just think, I don't want to be put in a group, because then people will say, oh, this group believes that, and therefore that I have to believe that. No, I'm an individual. I think people should do that. So it goes into a bunch of different things. For example, this whole DEI that they're doing at the universities. They say it's diversity, equity, and inclusion, but it's really ideology. And it's ideology that's trying to aggressively divvy people up in different categories and different groups. We've seen in some of these universities with the fallout with some of the Jewish students, how that line of thinking, people have linked that to some of the culture on campus, and I think that's probably true. The way DEI is actually practiced, it should stand for discrimination, exclusion, and indoctrination. It has no place in our public institutions, and so we got rid of it in Florida. I know Iowa has either got rid of it or in the process of getting rid of it. I think Texas has done that. So you have a handful of states that are doing it, but we are not going to go down the road of basically, they say it's used to remedy discrimination, and so they are, to quote remedy, they are practicing discrimination. And that's just totally unacceptable. So we'll get rid of that across the federal government. And we will end the DEI cartel once and for all.
Something that I've been thinking a lot about is I feel like on the other side, they kind of voice this idea that if we don't have a whole bunch of government going in to rescue inner cities, rescue people in poverty, that we just don't care about the issue. My answer is, of course we care, we just don't think the government is the solution to every single problem that exists. But saying that, it doesn't mean that there's nothing that can be done. So my question is, when you're looking at, these struggling inner city or low income neighborhoods and communities, what is the role, especially at the federal level, rather than just saying, well, there's nothing that can be done? What is your opinion?
And what's your name?
Jessica.
Thank you, Jessica. No, look, I think that's I think you put it perfectly. And actually, that's the approach we've taken in Florida. So, for example, and it's not just limited to low income, government can't solve these problems. That's obvious. I mean, we saw, in the 60s, they did a war on poverty. They said they just spend money that will end poverty. And what happened is they created a culture of dependency that caused problems. So it was a total failure. And other stuff that's been done just hasn't done. So what's the role? Government's role is, there are certain things that it can do, but we've tried to use government in Florida to be a facilitator for resources that are outside of the bureaucracy. So for example, my wife started something called Hope Florida, Pathway to Prosperity. So when you go in for, say, welfare benefits, yeah, you can just say, here, whatever the state can give you and do that, and then just keep coming back. But we know that's a dead end, right? So she created something called the Hope Care Portal. I know Iowa's working on this too. So we've invited churches, we've invited charities and nonprofits, we've invited businesses, we've invited even individual volunteers to be plugged into this portal. Someone comes in, maybe it's a mom who got evicted from her apartment, she's got 2 kids and she needs a place to stay. That goes. Now maybe government can help, but the minute that goes in, it goes out to all these other groups. Guess what? The churches spring into action. Maybe an individual just springs into action and do. So government is serving as a way to connect people to a lot of resources that are in our society, because people want to help their fellow citizen, but when people need the help, a lot of times they don't know where to turn. So we're going to do this, for example, the federal government, we're going to do it with veterans issues. The VA, I'm the only veteran that's running for president, and so I remember leaving active duty, getting a stack of papers about veterans benefits, and I didn't need anything, but like I didn't understand what was in. I mean, it was bureaucracy. And it's a terrible bureaucracy. So people go into the VA, maybe they'll get help, a lot of times they don't. We'll have a portal where we'll have these veterans groups plugged in. We'll have charities, we'll have churches, we'll have businesses, we'll have individuals. And it could just be something, a veteran has post-traumatic stress that goes out. Maybe it's just one individual that gets out and says, you know what, that person lives, in the neighborhood next to me. Shows up, hey, I just want to make sure you're okay. Can I take you out to get lunch? Just doing that may avert a suicide. And then you have something where we have groups that train service dogs to be paired with veterans with post-traumatic stress. And it mitigates the symptoms, and the suicide rate goes down dramatically. And then there's so much in the private sector of people that want to help veterans in particular. So that, I think, is the role, is really being a conduit to some of these things. But if it's just a bureaucracy going in, that is not going to change the trajectory of any of these communities. Sir.
Good morning. As a native Floridian, I can tell you that I've lived in Iowa 28 years. The best advice I got from my wife is put your coat on before you put your gloves on.
Okay.
So my question is simply, I don't think the average citizen knows the challenge that the administrative state at a federal level has on the impact that it has on their life. I look at it from the perspective of the Medicare, home health, and hospice industry, and this is an industry that sees an additional 750 to 1,000 pages of new regulations every year. They keep seeing their reimbursement cut every year, and just in the last week, MedPAC says, oh, we need to reduce benefits by another 20%. Do you remember when the Democrats ran that TV ad about pushing grandma over the cliff? Okay. It's already happening, but it's happening so quietly and so subtly behind the scenes from the administrative state. Yep. So the question is, how can your administration have a significant impact on this administrative state, not just in healthcare, but all these...
And your name is?
Randy.
And what part of Florida were you from?
St. Pete. You and I talked about that in Lake Wales.
Oh, okay, yeah. Okay, well, thank you. I think it's a great question. Honestly, it's a question that raises implications about who governs this country.
Right.
Do we, the people, govern ourselves? Do these elections matter? Or are the elections just suggestions where an entrenched bureaucracy just does what it wants anyways? And I think the policies that are implemented by the bureaucracy oftentimes are very destructive policies. I mean, for example, in Iowa, they were fighting the waters of the United States. What, you have a puddle on your farm, someone can come in on the EPA and you're subject to federal jurisdiction? It's ridiculous. That's not what the people have ever enacted through Congress. It's bureaucrats run amok. These are nameless, faceless bureaucrats who nobody in this room has ever voted for or will ever be able to vote out of office. And so it's a massive amount of power that's basically been transferred from we the people to this effectively fourth branch of government. How do you deal with it? Well, one, you need a president that understands the problem. And, look, I mean, Donald Trump was president for 4 years. He did not make a dent in the administrative state. He did not make a dent in draining the swamp. That's just the reality. And in fact, he's now running saying he wants to build a $1 billion plus new headquarters for the FBI right smack in the middle of Washington, D.C. That isn't draining the swamp, that's deepening the swamp. So I would not do that. So I think, so you got to be focused, you got to be disciplined, and you got to understand this power is accumulated over many decades. They are not just going to give it up willingly. So you have levers of power at your disposal, and you got to pull those levers in a way that are methodical and strategic. For example, we tried to get Trump to do this, and he didn't do it until, he tried to do it at the very end, but it was too late. You have about 50,000 bureaucrats that are involved in policy making. Well, they should not be in civil service. They should be a separate Schedule F where they could be fired at will. And so we're going to do that. Because if they're exercising judgment that affects your life, you've got to be accountable to the elected president of the United States. I also think we're going to use Article 2 power over the civil service as well. I mean, we can lay off folks. And I think so there's a size and the scope of government. Size, think about this. Florida, we have millions of more people than New York does. Our budget's half the size of New York. We have the lowest per capita state employees in the country, lowest cost per state employee in the country per capita. And yet, when people move to Florida from New York, they tell them, oh my gosh, your infrastructure's better, your schools, all of their services. So we're doing it at like half the footprint. So much of the bureaucracy is just bloat that you can reduce, and you wouldn't miss a beat on actually doing the core things government needs to do. But then you also have the scope of government, which is them getting involved in all these other things. And some of that is like the weaponization that we've seen. You got to be willing to fire people. If an FBI agent is surveilling school board people, moms going to school board meetings, I'm firing those people. You fire the director when they're working with big tech to censor dissent. Clean house. You have to hold these agencies accountable when they exceed the scope of their lawful authorities. And so we're going to do that. But you know, part of the reason the administrative state rears its head is because the Congress doesn't use the power of the purse to discipline it. They do continuing resolutions and omnibus bills. That's government on autopilot. That is not doing anything to really do. Like in Florida, for example, and I'm sure Iowa reacts quickly too to these things. We had an agency that was involved with combating domestic violence. So there was a nonprofit that they had basically contracted out to run it. And this had been a legacy for decades in Florida. I came in my first or second year as governor. We started getting reports that they were mismanaging the funds, lining the pockets of the directors, all this stuff. That news broke, took like 2 days to verify the reports. The next week, the legislature came in and zeroed them out, like done, right off the bat. That's how Congress is supposed to act. They're supposed to be very, very concerned about how the government's using its powers. And instead, what do these guys do? They'll go in a committee hearing and they'll complain. They'll go on cable news and they'll complain. They'll send fundraising emails and say, you need to support them so they can fight back. And do they ever actually do anything to change? No, they don't, because they're scared. They're scared of having a government shutdown. They're scared of the media attacking. They're scared of all this. So Congress has been pretty much useless with respect to this issue. I'm going to really goad them to do more, because ultimately we're going to be able to do a lot from the executive, but depriving the bureaucracy of the funding when it's doing things that are contrary to our freedoms is very, very important. The Founding Fathers created 3 branches of government. We have a de facto 4th branch. I think the task of the next president, and it will take 2 terms to do this, is to have that 4th branch disciplined, constitutionally accountable, so it's now part of the executive branch again. And your votes for president mean that how the government operates will meaningfully change depending on who's in the Oval Office, and that's what they intended. Wow, favorite baseball memory. Well, you know, I think in terms of like me playing or just watching baseball. Okay. So my favorite memory of watching baseball was probably when I was in college. You know, one of my buddies was that I'd played with growing up. His dad was the manager of the Red Sox. So I got to go to some games. So I was at a game in Yankee Stadium. I think it was 99 or 2000, somewhere around there, 98, 99, 2000. Pedro Martinez against the Yankees. He struck out 17, one hit, a solo home run by Chili Davis. That was the only, he would have had a perfect game if not for that. Just absolutely lights out. That was kind of a pitcher at his prime and a Hall of Fame pitcher at his prime. So that was something, that was really, really meaningful for us. In terms of, things that I've done, I mean, I played all the way through college. You have some good memories and some failures. But I would say probably, back in Little League, we went to the Little League World Series in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, and it's just something there were only 4 American teams that would make it. It's a very difficult to get there. But you go there, and it's like a stadium for Little League baseball. It was like the Shangri-La for Little League. You go in, and it's just like, it was immaculate, and it was like, wow, we're here kind of making the big time. And I think at a young age, it made, a big impression. Now, as you get older, to me, like, some of that stuff, isn't necessarily like, I'm more interested in like just being with my kids or something like that than necessarily, but at the time, it was really, really, really significant. So we had that, and that was something that you always remember. And people, so when I was there, we played, you played 3 games. I pitched the second game, and people have dug up the stats somehow of that game. And they were like, he struck out 12 people. He got 4 hits, including a home run and 7 RBIs. So I did hit a home run on that Howard Lamity Stadium, the Little League Taj Mahal. So. Let me give someone else a shot. Yes.
My name is Brian. I just live down the street. I've got a question about government debt. How do you solve it?
Well, that's a great question. So there's a debt clock in New York City where it shows the debt climbing up, famous clock. One of my buddies who's a congressman, he created a version of that you can put on your coat, your jacket pocket. And he wears it on the House floor, so you see the debt going up. He's an engineer, so he figured it out. He gave me one, and I said, that's nice. I was like, could you do one for the state of Florida? Because if you did one for Florida, it wouldn't be counting up. It would be counting down, because we've reduced our debt, paid off 25% of our state debt just since I became governor. That I think is kind of the approach that you want to do it. You got to be willing to use the veto pen when they're spending too much money. I look at COVID was, from the 21st century on, it's not been a great trajectory, but COVID kind of just did. They used COVID as a pretext to just shove a bunch of money out that they knew they couldn't do under normal circumstances. And so massive debt, starting with Trump, and he did $4.2 trillion just in his last year. Then Biden did 1.9 and other stuff. But what they've done is they basically just kept those levels of spending where those were never justified to begin with. And so you have to go back to where we were before that and then freeze that in place for the non-defense. I think that would save hundreds of billions of dollars. I think you have to do that. The other thing is I think you need structural reform. Part of the reason Florida, we've been able to pay down the debt is I have a balanced budget requirement in the state constitution. So you go in, there's not even a question about running a debt. Like you have to balance the budget. The other thing is I have a line item veto. They put a budget on my desk. I can veto individual items out. I vetoed 3% of the budget one year, $3.3 billion. I wouldn't have been able to pay down as much debt had I not done that. So you have your money is being spent on things like promoting transgenderism in Bangladesh. Is that really something that your tax dollars should? But president gets a big, massive bill, and you can fund everything and sign it, or you can fund nothing and veto it. So the incentives are to pack as much nonsense into there that the congressmen want, knowing that the vehicle's going to go and you're going to get that. Having that line item veto for president, I think, would be important. So balanced budget requirement and line item veto, that can be done through the states, and Florida has already done things like that. And I think you need term limits for members of Congress, because what happens is their main goal is to stay in office. That's just it. Well, if that's your goal and you're trying to deal with fiscal, borrowing is the best way to stay in office. because if they reduce spending, there are constituencies for the programs. Some people may get mad at you. Obviously, if you raise people taxes, they're going to get really mad at you. So they're always going to want to just do that. If you're term limited, I think, and I've seen this in Florida, people are thinking, okay, I'm here for 3 terms or whatever. I want to have something to show for it. I want to leave a legacy. I know I'm not going to be here for the next 20, 30 years. So I think they're willing to make better decisions. I think in Florida, it's shown having term limits has been a big benefit. So I think there are things in the long term. The incentives in Washington are hot-wired to produce the results we have right now. And I can sit there and tell you I'll offer better leadership, and I will, and it will make a difference. But is that going to be enough for 30 years, 40 years down the road? I think we got to have some structural change so that we're changing the incentives of how Washington operates.
Yes, sir.
So with that, do you have any plans for entitlement? Because that is a lot of the budget that is kind of seemingly untouchable, but eats up a lot of budget.
Well, you know, and probably this is one thing that I've heard from every part of Iowa when I've been visiting folks is, you know, something like a Social Security. I mean, I know that it's not an entitlement. You've paid into it. Every paycheck you ever earn your entire life, you get hit. No matter how little you make, you get hit for that. And so people work, and that's decades paying in every paycheck. And so I think, like, when you get to be 60, 65, you know, and beyond, people are just like, hey, wait a minute, you know, I paid into this, and so I have a right to expect to have some benefit. So that's kind of how I view it. I think people have been taxed a lot for this. I think Congress, because the programs used to run massive surpluses, and Congress would take the surplus and they would spend it on other things. And if they had just not done that, you would have no problem with those programs at all. In the short term, I think the one thing with Social Security is get the inflation and the interest rates down. Because what happens is when prices rise, they do a cost of living adjustment, which costs more from the program, but it is not enough to keep up with the rising prices. You're better off having no inflation and a lower cost of living because the dollar actually goes farther there. It's also better for the sustainability of the program. And the other thing in the near term is we have not had economic growth consistently above 3% since before the great financial crisis. And when you're growing, Florida is a great example of this. We grow. We have some of the best GDP growth, I think the best of any large state. If we were a separate country, we'd have some of the best GDP growth in the world. But what we do is we have a good environment for investment and business. We're #1 in new business formations, but we're cutting taxes every year. I mean, I've cut taxes more than any governor by far, and yet we are expanding our economic base. We're growing, so that leads to a gusher of revenue coming in, massive surpluses, and that's why we're paying down debt at the rate that we're doing. So it's a virtuous cycle of where good policy leads to good economic results, and then government fiscal is much easier to manage. In the federal, they have not grown at 3% plus, and so they're just not getting the type of benefits that Florida is getting when you're doing that. So you got to grow more. That means open up energy for production, so we lower energy costs. It means get the administrative state off the back of the economy. It means tapering the spending down, of course. It means doing things that are going to be conducive for a high growth environment. But we've not had a great run in terms of GDP growth, and I think we got to do a lot better.
Last question, folks.
Sir. Yep.
You talked about the administrative state, you talked about that and so forth. You both great governors. How are you going to drive a philosophy? Instead of my federal dollars going there, and then we have to jump through hoops to get our federal dollars back. How are you going to drive philosophy? Just let states keep their money and let our governors decide what to do.
Yeah, look, I think there's a lot of areas to do that. I mean, transportation and infrastructure, for example. I mean, people pay taxes, that are supposed to go directly to that, and then you send that to Washington, and then you get back. leave that here in Iowa and let them administer that. The money would go way further, and I think it would be more intelligently applied. So I'm definitely supportive of that. Ways to devolve power out of Washington, I'm going to be favorable for that. I mean, I just think that that's the nature of it. Now, that'll mean that, California may spend it in ways that I don't necessarily agree with, but I think ultimately voters get what they ask for in that regard, and so I'd much rather have power out of Washington. I think it makes more sense. And so there's a number of different, I think, areas where we could do that. I think it'll be really, really effective. Hopefully, we have. With me as the nominee, I view politics as a team effort. It's not just about you. We'll work very hard in these Senate races and in the congressional races because we need to increase the majority in the House, and we need to win 5 or 6 Senate seats, which is doable. Not doable based on the performance of 2022. Part of the reason I'm running is because I looked around the country after the election of 22. We were supposed to have a big red wave, and there may have been one here because of Kim, and there may have been one in Florida, but that was few and far between across the country. And we were in a situation where we had the best conditions to run in that we've probably ever had in 40 years. Unpopular Democrat president, inflation raging out of control, high energy prices, open border, crime in the inner cities, international turmoil, and it's like any Republican with a pulse should have been elected in that environment. And yet, the Democrats ran a playbook focusing on the past, focusing on the former president, focusing on these things, and that really, caused us to come up far short. We should have won 240, 245 House seats. Instead, we barely had the majority, and a lot of that is because New York and Florida each added 4 seats. The rest of the country, just didn't do what it wanted to do. We obviously have to do better there, and it is a team effort, and you don't want to have a presidency which is just limited to doing executive orders. First of all, you're limited in what you can do with executive orders, but then second of all, the next president comes in, just like when Biden came in, he reversed everything Trump did on day 1. Up in smoke. You got to get stuff through Congress so it has staying power, because once you do it, it's much harder to undo. An executive order can be undone usually at the stroke of the pen. Now, you have a 2-term president, which I think we need. That stuff does take hold over an 8-year period in ways that does make it harder for a subsequent, even on an executive order basis. But still, you got to get it through the Congress. And so we're going to be doing that. And I think we have great opportunities across this country to be able to get that done. And I would just say, in terms of, you look at the different stuff with, with how a general election would work out, everyone who's running has an election track record, right? Donald Trump, Haley, me. And I've always overperformed whatever polls said. My election last time was the best victory any Republicans ever had in the history of governor's races in the entire state of Florida. We were winning urban areas, we were winning suburban areas, we were winning all different categories. That's showing you that it can be done. People weren't predicting that we would do that. The pundits, they were, in their own world, but we knew what we were doing, and we were able to deliver. My fear with the former president is there's just so many people that are dug in against him that even if they agree with us on policy, they're just not going there. They have that. We need to get everyone that's open to walking away from leftist policy, and I think that's a big majority of this country. But we need every vote that we can get, and we don't want to leave any of these votes on the table, and so I think I provide the best opportunity for that. So again, I'll ask you for your support on Monday. I know it's going to be cold. I know it's going to be not the most pleasant, but I don't think you'll ever be able to cast a vote that has more impact given the circumstances. We don't know what the turnout's going to be. It could be much smaller than what it's been in the 16 cycle. That's possible. So if you're going out and you're bringing 4 or 5 different friends with you or family members, that is going to pack a punch in a way that voting in a general election just simply would not at that level. So I'd encourage you to be a part of that. We're asking you to caucus for us and bring as many people that you can. One thing I can say is that in Florida, I'll have people come up to me who didn't support me in the primary for governor in 18, and they'll say, yeah, I got that one wrong. You've done a great job. I'm glad you won the primary. Or people that did vote for me in the primary would say, I liked you. I knew you would do a good job, but you've done so much better than anything I could have imagined. Don't we want somebody that will over deliver rather than under deliver for a change? Thank you all. God bless.